We are now reconvened in open session. We will now consider action on closed session items. Mrs. Taussand.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Board of Trustees authorize initiation of litigation to appeal Attorney General ruling OR 2019-14232.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Taussand and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Next, Mrs. Helliger. Actually, I'm sorry, Mrs. James. Sorry about that.
Yes, Mr. President, I move that the Board of Trustees purchase 20 acres of real property adjacent to Elkins High School for a potential future campus and authorize the superintendent to negotiate, execute, amend, or terminate any agreements and closing documents necessary for the purchase.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Mrs. James?
Yes, Mr. President, I move that the Board of Trustees delegate authority to the superintendent to appoint and approve contracts of employment for campus principals, directors, and executive directors for the 2019-20 school year, and further move that this delegation of authority expire on August 15th, 2019.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion?
Dr. Dupree, are you going to give us a report on who you hire at the August meeting?
Yes, ma'am. I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Mrs. Helliger.
I move that the Board of Trustees propose termination of the term employment contract of Mary Robin Gaston for the 2019-20 school year for good cause, and to authorize the superintendent or his designee to notify Ms. Gaston of this action in accordance with applicable law and policy.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Helliger and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. We are now going to move on to 11A, which is our activity report. None of us filled out the activity report
We were convening.
because we were in there for 3 hours handling business. So we are going to move that to next month. Moving on to 11B, Audit Committee Report. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. I've included a copy of this report. It was posted on the website for you. It simply states the requirements for an efficiency audit, and there's no need for me to talk about it anymore tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Moving on to 11C, do we have any special reports? All right. We will now consider our consent agenda.
Mr. President, I move that we accept the consent agenda as presented.
We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mrs. Taussand. Do we have discussion? Mr. Rosenthal.
Yes, I just have a couple questions about 3 items. So do we need to pull them, or they're just simple questions?
Just ask him, sir.
Okay. 12D I1 about the school buses. So I saw the list of approved vendors, and I want to know, are any of these CNG buses?
No, sir.
Is there a reason?
Yes, sir, we're not, at this point, we're not purchasing CNG buses with this purchase. We will be looking at purchasing future buses, but at this point, these do not include any CNG.
And what was the total again? I'm trying to remember.
The-
How many total buses are we getting in this one?
Oscar, you might point out and discuss the type of buses that these are.
Yeah, I know, these are, I've got that. There's some of them that are the big, activity buses and others, but some of the vendors actually listed, if you looked at item, listed CNG.
Michael, how many buses were those?
The buses that are being purchased in this particular order are only special needs buses. So they're the 20 special needs buses, 14 of the small 14 passenger buses, and 6 activity buses.
Okay, so that's like, how many altogether? About? I mean, we're around like dozens.
It's $3.3 million total.
Okay,
It's 20 special needs buses, 10 of the 14 passenger buses,
okay,
and then 6 of the activity buses. 36.
okay. Okay,
The larger buses have not been ordered yet. However, they did bid on them, so we did a bid for everything, but at this particular time, we're only purchasing the special needs buses.
okay. All right, so when will we be taking a look at, additional CNG buses?
That is coming up as soon as we can get to the next agenda item, which is probably going to be in August or September.
Okay. Okay, all right, thank you. And then, this is probably for an Oscar question, 12D 8H. So this was listed under, like other expenses and whatnot, so, or other professional services. I'm just curious, do we just do this just to document the work and?
Yes, sir. We did this for Bond 2014, and it's been very successful. What they do is they go out on a weekly basis, or any time that they're going to be, there's going to be an inspection or closing up a wall, and they take documentation pictures from the same location. So what it gives us is, it gives us an ability at the end of a project to literally be able to peel that back. If we needed to find out if there was something behind the wall,
Got it.
we could peel it back or whatever. And so we're utilizing, it's been very successful. We utilized it during Harvey, if you recall, on Juan Seguin, and it really helped us. We brought them in the minute that we knew we had damage, and they take very high-quality photos.
Great, okay, cool. And then, Mr. Bassett, on 12D3, the small kitchen equipment, I noticed that some of it's from the general fund. Is there a reason that we're not using all of it from the child nutrition fund?
That's for some of the miscellaneous things we have, like upstairs kitchen. There's some just miscellaneous.
Okay. So it's not all?
No, but I mean, it's almost,
Student-oriented, okay.
it just gives us the latitude
Sure.
in case we have to, but
Okay.
it's
No, I was
almost
just
all
curious.
going to be child
Especially
nutrition.
Okay, since the question came up earlier about, spending down that child nutrition fund budget, so.
Right.
Okay, cool. I'm good.
Please vote. Motion passes unanimously. We are now going to move on to our action items. First up is 13A1. Consider approval of the 2019-20 General Fund 199 Debt Service Fund and the Child Nutrition Fund 240 budgets.
Mr. President, I move to approve the recommended action.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mrs. Toussaint. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. We will, 13A2, consider approval of the committed fund balance resolution.
Mr. President, I move to approve the action item as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Tossan and a second by Mr. Rosenthal. Do we have discussion? Mrs. James.
I have a question on this. So I was asking about the campus activity funds, and I guess that becomes like a holding place for those. Is that is that a good way to describe it? Rather,
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
But it's definitely there for the campuses to use as intended.
okay, that's good. Thank you for that clarification. And then the instructional materials allotment, I was just reading in your answer that there's actually a zero balance, or is similarly a holding place for that?
Well,
those
similarly, I mean, we don't recognize the revenue until it's spent. And so it's just a technicality in terms of how it works. I mean, we still know that there's funds available to us because there's an allocation to us. But from an accounting perspective, we don't recognize them yet.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to 13A3, consider approval of compensation proposal for 2019-20.
Mr. President, I move that we approve item A3 to consider approval of compensation proposal for 2019-20 as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Helliger and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. 13A4, consider approval of budget amendments and use of the general fund major maintenance funds.
Mr. President, I move that we consider approval of budget amendment and use of general fund major maintenance funds as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Helliger and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to 13B1, consider approval of proposed interlocal agreement with Fort Bend County regarding the conveyance of an abandoned cemetery. Mrs. Tossan.
Yes, Mr. President. I move that we consider approval in principle of a proposed interlocal agreement with Fort Bend County regarding the conveyance of an abandoned cemetery and other district property as described in the proposed agreement for the purposes of preserving the cemetery, creating a memorial park, and educating students and the greater Fort Bend ISD community about the cemetery and the state's convict leasing program, and delegation of authority to President Burdine to finalize negotiation of the same.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Tossan and a second by Mrs. Helliger. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to 14, review future board meeting agenda items. Dr. Dupree.
Yes, sir. We meet next on July the 15th. At that time, we'll provide an update on the Gifted and Talented Task Force update, including the program evaluation for that program. We'll also give an internal audit report from Gibson Consulting. And then in August, we'll also have one board meeting on the 12th of August. On the 5th, the board will do a team building activity, but on the 12th, we'll hear the 18 and 19 STAR Performance and State Accountability update.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. May I have a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
Meeting is adjourned.